Adjunct Professor Moran, Macroeconomics 111. In our prior lesson, we learned a little bit about the history of capitalism. And now we're going to talk about the 5 principles of capitalism. Principles are rules or guidelines. And without any one of these rules, our system of capitalism would break down. You need all 5 of them to work. Now, when we talk about the principles, that's what gives us capitalism. But for each principle, there's a limitation. And the limitation is an example of socialism in our system. And that's what gives us a mixed economic system. We're predominantly capitalistic, but we do have elements of socialism. You're taking a course at Suffolk, and that's a service provided by the government, an example of socialism. The first principle of capitalism is freedom of enterprise. There are 2 freedoms, one to work and one to earn money. A shop. So freedom of enterprise is your right to go into any line of business that you like. We want to maximize production. Who knows better than you what you're good at? So you should be free to go to be a land labor entrepreneur or land labor on capital entrepreneur. It's your right to choose what to do with your factors of production. But there's limitations on that in the United States, and one is regulation. So if you try to give PSE&G, the local electric company, a run for its money by trying to start an electric distribution company, you won't be able to, because a monopoly has been given to PSE&G for that purpose. That's an example of a limitation on your freedom of enterprise. Licenses. For example, a medallion in the city costs more than $1 million, and you can't drive a cab without it. That's a limitation on your freedom of enterprise. Now, these are laws of human behavior. You can't just overrule them without anticipating unexpected consequences. So, for example, in the city, you'll see people waiting at a bus stop. A city bus will pull away, and there'll still be people waiting there. And a minivan will pull up, and people will get on the minivan. And that person doesn't have taxi plates, or he's not a bus legally. That's called a gypsy cab. And some people prefer their services to others, and he's doing it illegally. And that's one of the unintended consequences of placing a limitation on freedom of enterprise. Now, you take freedom of enterprise for granted because you're an American and you're going to college to improve your future financially and decide what career to enter. But some countries don't have that. Andrew Carnegie, for example, popularized the use of Bessemer steel, which was essential to the Industrial Revolution in his country. Now, Andrew Carnegie was born a bobbin boy in England. A bobbin boy is a person who climbs on top of textile equipment and changes the spool of thread. Now, in that kind of aristocratic, peasant, nobility kind of situation, his freedom of enterprise was limited. He comes to the United States, he becomes a captive of industry, and has a significant impact on American history because of freedom of enterprise. Your right to choose which factor of production you're going to produce. That's a medallion that goes on a city cab, a limitation on freedom of enterprise. Another principle of capitalism is private property. So private property is defined as property owned by individuals and firms, not the government. It's your right to own the factors of production. And with your right to own the factors of production, land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship, you're going to make sure that they're used to the most profitable possible use because you're driven by self-interest. And that unintentional consequence will be that you will produce the mix of goods and services most desired by society. Now, there were limitations on this. For example, eminent domain and inheritance taxes. Eminent domain is the right of the government to seize your personal property if they give you due process. It's in the Constitution. If you've ever wondered why the expressway is so straight, it's because they condemned all of the houses that were in the way according to eminent domain, which is a violation of private property principle of capitalism. You also have to use your property within legal limits. So you can't be screaming your 5-liter Mustang down North Country Road and get pulled over and say, well, it's my right as a capitalist, that's to private property. You have to use it safely within legal limits. Another principle of capital, which is an example of socialism. Another principle of capitalism is the profit motive. The profit is the amount of income left over after subtracting expenses from sales. Profit motive is the reason people go into business and sacrifice so much, because they get the reward of doing it well. The limitation here is an example of a limitation on this would be a windfall profit. So if you remember Hurricane Sandy in 2012, there were some gas stations that charged an exorbitant amount for gasoline. And that is not allowed under the law. And so there were county inspectors that went around and interviewed some gas station owners to see if they made windfall profits. Consumer sovereignty is another freedom. This is your freedom to buy things. If the purpose of economics is to satisfy wants, who knows better than you do what wants you have? So you should be free to go out and buy things that satisfy those wants. It's like voting. You buy things from producers who are better at satisfying your wants, both in terms of quality and price. And you punish and don't shop at producers who don't do as good a job. These producers may in fact go out of business. And although as heartless as this may seem, that's good, because they will be freeing up resources that then can go and be used to produce other things, whereas the people who have done a successful job in producing and satisfying consumers' wants will be rewarded. The limitations on consumer sovereignty is sometimes the government regulates or prohibits the sale of certain goods or services. So prohibition, for example, people wanted to buy alcohol to satisfy a basic human want. The government prevented this. The unintended consequence, and that's an example of socialism. The unintended consequence of this was that people were going to buy alcohol anyway, illegally, in the black market. Monopolies are a restriction on consumer sovereignty, and that's why the government has laws saying that the government can, if it chooses, break up monopolies in order to promote more choice among consumers. Otherwise, monopolies are the only provider of a product in a field, restricting consumer sovereignty. The final principle of capitalism, rules that are necessary in order to make our system work, is competition. Competition is a rivalry between sellers in a particular field for consumers in that market. If you think about your high school sports program, you were told to dress up in hard resin plastic, knock the other guy to the ground, and step on him and go, "I win." The hidden message in that is we are trying to promote in you the sense of competition, because it's important in a capitalist system to believe that. There are very few clubs in high school where you sit around singing "Kumbaya, let's all get along" in a very socialistic way. We believe as capitalists that competition serves to reduce prices and improve quality. And you can see that occasionally in the supermarket, for example, when Coke begins a price war against Pepsi and cuts its price in an attempt to take sales away from Pepsi. Now, an example of socialism, a limitation on competition, is the responsibility that businesses have to resort to truth in advertising. General Motors can't say Ford stands for found on road dead because it's not truthful in advertising. My brother's a Chevy fan, so he makes fun of Fords. So you have to resort in truthful advertising. This concludes our discussion of the principles of capitalism, rules that are necessary in order to make our system work.